Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome. My name is Patricia Anderson. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm happy to produce this first Monday's webinar for PSG Consulting. Thank you for joining us. I'm just going to make a few announcements while everybody comes into the digital space here, and we'll turn it over pretty quickly to our hosts and speakers today for a really important and lively discussion about the current election and the bigger issues at play. We're here on Zoom webinars. So that means we cannot see or hear you. You can see and hear the speakers, but we do really value and encourage your engagement. We invite you to do that through the Q&A feature. It looks like a couple of talk bubbles, and you can usually find it at the bottom of your screen. We will do our very best to answer as many of your questions as we can while we're here live today. And if we're unable to get to all of your questions, rest assured that we will share them with our speakers after the fact. The recording of this webinar will be posted on PSG Consulting website later this week. And you can also later this month listen to it on podcast via Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And we'll be sending you information about how to access that podcast when it's published. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our host, Paige Gardner. Paige, take it away.
Thanks, Patricia. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And I thank you for your support and for your most precious commodity, which is your time. We want to start by playing a video that Donald Trump supporters made, likening Trump to a divine servant of a Christian God. As someone who grew up attending church and Sunday school, I find this breathtaking, if not blasphemous. Play the tape.
And on June 14th, 1946, God looked down on his planned paradise and said, I need a caretaker. So God gave us Trump. God said, I need somebody willing to get up before dawn, fix this country, work all day, fight the Marxists, eat supper, then go to the Oval Office and stay past midnight at a meeting of the heads of state. So God made Trump. I need somebody with arms, strong enough to rustle the deep state, and yet gentle enough to deliver his own grandchild. Somebody to ruffle the feathers, tame cantankerous World Economic Forum, come home hungry, have to wait until the First Lady is done with lunch with friends, then tell the ladies to be sure and come back real soon, and mean it. So God gave us Trump.
Breathtaking as you watch that. But it's important to note that this is not just about Donald Trump. It really is about the MAGA worldview. And as our speakers today will explain, it's about a movement called Christian nationalism. And this movement has very little to do with Christianity and a lot to do with white supremacy and right-wing authoritarianism. And it's been used to justify attacks on the democratic process and the Constitution and all sorts of people. Their cultural and political power should not be underestimated as we go in to 2024. So today we're going to discuss their core beliefs, their view on what makes America strong, and their need for racial, religious, and gender hierarchies, supposedly determined by God. So I want to turn it over to the three most knowledgeable speakers on this topic. And we want to begin with Robert Jones, the recent author of The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the president of Public Religion Research Institute. Robbie, thanks.
Well, hi, everyone. I'm glad to be with you all midday on a Monday. You know, when you see that video, it's really hard to know where to start. When you see it, I'm going to resist the temptation to, you know, go into all the bad theology behind there. But I am going to kind of, you know, it's easy, I think, also to ridicule it and, you know, kind of spoof it for the ways that it oversteps in so many ways. But I want to focus on like what parts of it to take seriously. And I do think it is this existential threat piece and the way that Trump is kind of being positioned as this divinely ordained figure to stand between you know, his supporters and what they are kind of depicting as evil, chaos, Marxists, etc. So the need for this strongman authoritarian you know, Messiah-like figure to kind of save the country from the impending doom and chaos. I mean, I think that's the basic thing. And, you know, we see this in this, even in the MAGA mantra, and I've said this a lot, but I think it's worth repeating that I think everybody's focused on the Make America Great part of that mantra, but it really is that last word, again, that has given it most of its power, is this nostalgia for reaching back to a kind of mythical past where the country was something different than it is today. And that something different is typically posited, not just as a white America, that's certainly it, but I think the thing that's often missed in kind of general circles is that it is this kind of positive vision of a white Christian America. That's the norm that's being held up, and that has really always been held up in this country, really since before its inception. And so I want to, the movement that is kind of we've used or the term we used to talk about this movement in most recent years is Christian nationalism. And I want to share with you just a few set of slides kind of documenting this kind of quantitatively from a survey that PRRI did with the Brookings Institution last year. And just a heads up for everybody here, at the end of the month, we'll be releasing a 50-state update to this study so that we'll have, we're actually going to be able to map the prevalence of white Christian nationalist views all the way down to the state level coming up in the last week of February. So just a few weeks, we'll have that out. But in the meantime, let me give you just a quick overview of how prevalent these views are and kind of where they are the most prevalent. So let me start this off here. Oops, sorry about that. There we go. All right. So this is a survey that we conducted about a year ago at PRRI and in partnership with the Brookings Institution. It was a very large survey, about 5,000 Americans, and we really tried to get at just how many Americans believe this ideal. And what we did is we quantified it with 5 statements. So in a minute, I'll show you kind of how many people kind of believe these statements and to what degree they believe these statements. But quantifying it, and you can see here what runs through this is basically an idea of Christian dominionism, right? The idea that Christians should be in charge of the country, the U.S. government should declare itself a Christian nation, God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of society, U.S. law should be based on Christian values, etc. So what we did is we combined all these statements into one composite index, and then using that index, divided the responses into essentially 4 categories. The first 2 were people who essentially affirmed those statements. 10% of the country strongly affirmed all of those statements. Another 19% of the country agreed with those statements, just not as strongly. So that gives us about 3 in 10 Americans, 29% of the country who affirms this worldview, this Christian nationalist worldview. And about 39% of the country who leans against it, but mostly against it, but not completely, and 29% of the country that rejects this worldview altogether. So on the one hand, the country rejects this view by a margin of 2-1. But as we'll see, the reason why we're hearing so much about it is that it is amplified well beyond its numbers, both by one religious group, white evangelical Protestants, who are Trump's most stalwart supporters, and by virtue of that group, it has become to be a majority view inside the Republican Party. And you can see what effect this has on a number of other views. When we just look at here, like whether people prefer to live in a pluralistic country or not. You can see again by a margin of 3-1, most Americans say they prefer to live in a pluralistic country. Only about a quarter say they prefer to live in a kind of monolithic, more Christian country. However, if you look at the white Christian nationalism adherents, those who most strongly affirm those views, you can see the exact opposite. And even among sympathizers, there's still a majority who say they prefer to live in a majority Christian nation. And you see the differences among those who reject those statements. So who are they? Just give you a quick slides on kind of by religion and by political affiliation. By and large, the group, again, some Trump's stalwart supporters support him 81% in 2016, 85% in 2020. At the polls, 2/3 of this group are either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers, leaning toward that worldview here overwhelmingly. And you can kind of see the rest of it here. The other thing to say is that there's been some kind of pontification, I think, by some pundits and some journalists that Trump supporters are actually Christian in name only, right? They're not actually connected to churches. We find no evidence of that. In fact, we find the opposite, that this worldview, this Christian nationalist worldview, is actually strongly connected to church attendance here. So there's, in fact, a linear relationship that the more one attends church, the more likely one is to hold these views of Christian dominance and Christian nationalism. So you can just see just how strongly they are. About half of those who attend once a week or more are actually either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers, compared to only about 18% of those who attend religious services either seldom or never. And then finally, you can see how this plays out among partisan groups. Among Republicans, it's 54%. Again, so a majority of one of our two political parties has now become basically captured by this worldview. And just as an aside, white evangelicals make up about 35% of Republicans. So even though they only make up 14% of the country, 1/4, they make up more than a third of the Republican Party. And if you put, and the Republican Party has essentially become a kind of white Christian party. It is about 70%. Self-identified Republicans today are about 70% white and Christian, compared to a country that is only 42% white and Christian. Democrats today are only about a quarter white and Christian. So you can see how they're kind of getting amplified through a partisan lens here. And then the other place they're getting amplified is, of course, through television media, most strongly through the far-right television news sources. These are places like Newsmax, One American News. Here you see those who say they most trust those far-right news sources, they are like 80% likely to be Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. And those who most trust Fox News, again, a majority of those say they are either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. So there's kind of a partisan megaphone, a media megaphone that is kind of building in this, that the MAGA movement has really now become, this is kind of one of the key things holding it together and kind of presenting Trump as the protector of this worldview going forward. And I'm going to stop there with the slides. I'm just going to say just two more quick comments, though. It is important to remember that Trump's favorability has never fallen below 60% among white evangelical Protestants. It has typically been higher among those who go to church most often, right? So it's really important to remember, I think, for the dynamics here, that it is not the case that conservative white Christians are holding their nose and supporting Trump for some narrow reason, like getting judges or abortion. And in fact, what we see is that it is a strong favorability numbers, strong voting numbers. There's not a lot of reticence here. And in fact, the support around kind of like anti-immigrant vision is actually stronger than their support for Trump on the basis of abortion. So it really is this immigration that is, again, feeding this idea of preserving a white Christian America, and that he is in many ways God's instrument, even if he's an ungodly person, that he is nonetheless God's instrument in achieving this end. That, again, as I think Kelly and Kristen will both talk about, goes back to before. And it's one of the things my latest book kind of maps out, right? Is that this idea goes back before the founding of the country. This idea of the country as a kind of promised land for European Christians is at the heart of what's being protected here. And in fact, even when we ask that question, we find majorities of white evangelicals, majorities of Republicans agreeing with the statement that straight up says God intended America to be a promised land for European Christians. And so I think understanding that and grasping that as the kind of key thing that is the glue between Donald Trump and his white conservative Christian supporters, I think is really key. And I'll stop there and I will hand it over to Katherine.
The host I think, needs to let my video start again. Great. Is that right? It says I can't start. It says start my video. Great. Thank you so much, Robbie. That was such a great presentation, and thank you for laying it all out. I want to thank Reverend Douglas, too, for joining us, and Paige and Patricia for organizing this great seminar and this very important conversation. over the past 15 years, I've been researching and writing about the rise of the religious right as a political force in America. I've attended innumerable conferences and strategy gatherings and summits. And at these things in recent years, look, this movement long preceded Trump, but in recent years, once he was on the scene, you started to hear him referred to as a biblical king, like King David or King Cyrus, chosen by God to lead America at this time. So for those outside the movement, this can seem really confusing because this is a movement that supposedly stands for family values. That's what they claim. And people wonder how folks who claim to stand up for good morals could actually put this slavish support behind someone so patently corrupt and bigoted in every way and unfit. We can't really understand this development without understanding Christian nationalism and how it works. So I want to take a minute to do that, and then I'm going to return to talking about Trump a bit. So Christian nationalism, as Robbie laid out, is not a religion. It's not Christianity. It's a political phenomenon that involves the exploitation of religion for political gain. It's basically the idea that America was founded as a Christian nation. Our laws should be based on the Bible. But that set of ideas is a key component of a political movement that's exploiting religion in its quest for power. Something to really take in is that this movement is not coming from the grassroots. It's a leadership-driven and organization-driven movement. And it's a huge amount of money that flows through this dense organizational network. That organizational network consists of right-wing policy groups, think tanks, legal advocacy organizations, networking organizations that get members of the leadership on the same page. There are very sophisticated data initiatives. A lot of this, much of the movement functions as a kind of voter turnout machine in election seasons. There are these very large pastoral networks that draw in tens of thousands of conservative-leaning pastors into community with one another. The leadership of the movement, members of leadership do presentations, give them very sophisticated tools to get them all on the same page. They get to turn out, they want them to turn out their congregations to vote their supposedly biblical values, because they know that pastors are often the most trusted leaders in their communities. The takeover of public education is, of course, one of their big goals. So there are a lot of education-focused initiatives that we're seeing today that are intended to foster mistrust in public education and legitimize direct government funding of conservative religious schools. And then there's this vast messaging and disinformation sphere that actively generates or exploits cultural conflict, cultivates resentment and grievance, and sort of directs all of this grievance at perceived political enemies. Something to remember about this movement, as Robbie laid out, is it's radically anti-democratic. Its proponents reject the principles of equality and pluralism and justice that represent the best of the American promise. They're driving support for an agenda that many, if not most, American Christians would see as antithetical to their faith. So it's really a way of dividing people between the supposedly righteous and the supposedly unrighteous, the insiders versus the outsiders. It's very identitarian. The right is often accusing the left of playing identity politics, but they're really playing it a lot harder. It's really about symbolic boundaries, who gets to properly belong in the nation and who does not. So that leads us back to Trump. Why did the organizational leadership of this movement support him? And by the way, I lay out a lot of what that organizational leadership looks like in great detail in my book, The Power Worshippers. So if anybody's interested in, sort of delving into any of those categories, I really get into that on a granular level. So Trump really threw open the doors to this movement and its leadership. He gave them unprecedented political access. He gave them unprecedented power. He delivered policies that were favorable to their interests, directed a lot of taxpayer money in their direction. But more to the point, he delivered policies that were favorable to the movement's funders, because a lot of the funders of the movement are, I would say, as preoccupied, if not more preoccupied, with far-right economic policies that are going to, low taxes or no taxes for the rich, minimal regulation of the types of industries that deliver to them their vast fortunes. And many of them I believe, think of the so-called culture wars as like the shiny baubles you got to dangle in front of the little people to get them to vote for these economic policies that are going to benefit them. But I think there's something that we can't overlook. Oh, judges. Before the 2016 election, I heard so many members of the leadership say things like, this election is about judges, 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 and really, take over the courts. It's very important to them because they know that many of their policies are really incredibly unpopular among the general population. The only way to really push them through and force their agenda on Americans is to take over the courts. If you can get the courts, you can really get a lot of policies passed and that most voters frankly don't want. So while it's true that this cohort got part of the deal they were looking for, you really can't explain the tenacity of the movement and the hyper loyalty of their support on purely transactional terms. There's like something about Trump's style of politics that speaks to this group, and that is, I would say, like authoritarian politics or tribal politics. It's us versus them. Look, Trump doesn't respect the rule of law, and he's willing to break things, which makes him the perfect leader for an authoritarian movement, a movement that seeks to overthrow modern representative democracy and replace it with a more authoritarian and theocratic order. And he encourages this when he speaks at his rallies. He'll say, when they come after me, they're coming after you. So he's encouraging this sort of, identitarian sense when he does that, and his supporters love that. His clear disdain for rules, is frankly part of the appeal. He's got this transparently amoral character, and that makes him the ideal leader of a religious nationalist state. He represents the lawlessness of the authoritarian. He puts himself above the law, and therefore, I think he represents the authoritarian impulses of a large number of his supporters who do not believe in equality or pluralism. So, if you, and a lot of the right-wing messaging sphere has persuaded members of the rank and file that they're in an existential struggle between absolute good and absolute evil. They're always characterizing the political opposition not as a loyal opposition, not as people who maybe want some of the same things, just have a different way of getting there, but as, satanic and demonic. If you go to these conferences or strategy gatherings, they're always referring to, the left, which is, center, moderate, liberal left, anyone to the left of them as, a communist, socialist, Illuminati, whatever. There's a whole range of very dehumanizing terms that they use, and Trump encourages this with his own incredibly dehumanizing language. So if you believe you're in an existential struggle between absolute good and absolute evil, and you're fighting for the good guys against the forces of evil, you don't want the nice guy who's going to follow the rules. You want the tough guy who's going to, smash heads as long as he's smashing the heads of your enemies. And I want to turn this over in a minute to Reverend Douglas, but I just want to say that there's always been a strain of authoritarian ideology in America. So this aspect of our politics is not new, but what has changed is that the gatekeeping institutions of the Republican Party, which were for some time making use of those who follow this ideology, they've really fallen apart. They're no longer able to resist it. For a long time, they thought the Christian fundamentalist right was a reliable voting bloc. They thought they could make use of that to advance their economic agenda. But in today's GOP, unfortunately, the extremists are running the show. So I want to turn it over now to Reverend Douglas. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Paige, and for bringing us all together and allowing me to be a part of this conversation with my friends and colleagues. So what I want to do is take a step back a little bit and ask, how did we get here? And so I want to share my screen with you, and let us begin. Now, that a figure like Donald Trump can rise up in our democracy and be a true existential political threat to our democracy is because of a greater fundamental threat that we have failed to recognize, or at least articulate. So I want to ask, how does his fear, his scapegoating, and his sort of presenting of himself as a savior work and attract so many people? Well, the first thing, let's see, I think that I need to do one more thing yes. It's rooted that he can take hold is rooted in what I call this sort of social cultural vulnerability of our very democracy. When people feel, and I quote John Friedman from Brown University, like they don't have a chance, or perhaps even more dangerously, when they feel like their kids don't have a chance, that inequality of opportunity is what really gets people upset. The greatest threat to our democracy, the most fundamental threat to any democracy, is indeed inequality, what I call the inequality gap. And what we need to know and be aware of is that 66% of total wealth in this country is owned by the top percent of wage earners. The lowest 50% of wage earners only owned 2.6% of the wealth. The top 1% of America's earners now control, and this is what's really startling, control more wealth than the entire middle class. The top 1% of American earners control more wealth than the entire middle class. That's an inequality gap. Inequality is the greatest threat to our democracy. It is the soil out of which a messianic figure like a Donald Trump can emerge. For a figure like Trump can then play upon three things, right? Of course, the fear of the disaffected, the fear of the marginalized, that they indeed will never be able to have, shall we say, the American dream, just to succeed, just to exist. He then is able, taking that fear, taking that disaffection, taking that real inequality, is then able to scapegoat, blame others for the predicament of, well, let's say 50% of the lowest wage earners. Who's to blame for that? And we see how Trump has scapegoated people of color, to immigrants, etc., for the marginalization of that, let's say, the lowest 50%. And then, so what they're looking for, right, is a solution. So Trump then presents himself as the savior, whether he is or not. I mean, he's in the top 1%, we would assume, whether he is or not. He presents himself as a savior for this very disaffected, very marginalized group of people. What is the social, economic, political soil for a messianic, quote unquote, figure like Trump to emerge? Inequality, the inequality gap. Now, there's also another sort of historical cultural soil that allows for not simply a figure like Trump, but Trump sits in the soil that has given birth to as both Katherine and Robbie have discussed, white Christian nationalism. This is in the very fabric of our nation. Now, as I make this transition quickly to white Christian nationalism, what's important to understand is we're talking about those people who feel disaffected, those people that are marginalized, that white Christians, indeed those people who give vent to, who are adherents and perhaps sympathizers as well of white Christian nationalism, really believe that white people and Christians are the most disaffected and put upon in our society. They really believe that they are the ones that are the oppressed in our society. And so when you put all of these things together, well, they become, again, most vulnerable to this ideology that is indeed white Christian nationalism. But white Christian nationalism doesn't come from it out of the blue. White Christian nationalism, the makings for white Christian nationalism are in the very DNA of this nation, the founding DNA of this nation. Two things come together: what I call Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism and the notion which both Katherine and Robbie have spoken to, alluded to, of manifest destiny in this nation. I will just highlight some things. I have spoken about this in much greater detail in my book, Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice for God. But let's look at Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. Oddly enough, it goes all the way back to a first century Roman historian named Tacitus, who wrote this book called Germania, which was said to be the most dangerous book ever written. Dangerous because it presents us with the foundation for the Anglo-Saxon myth, for the notion of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism, because he believed that this tribe in ancient woods of Germany, whom he would call Anglo-Saxons, were the most noble, most virtuous people around. They believed they had a distinct, he said, sense, an instinct for freedom, and their virtue was beyond compromise. The Anglo-Saxon myth emerges. And so that myth, and I'm jumping, but what we have to understand is that myth, as it comes through England, is that those in England believed they were Anglo-Saxons, but then in England, it was assumed that it was tainted by the Anglo-Saxon exceptional nature of the government, of the people, of society, was tainted by Catholics and tainted by during the sort of Norman invasion in 1026. So you had Puritans and Pilgrims who would emerge and believe themselves responsible for carrying forth the true Anglo-Saxon heritage. And where did those people come? When they fled England, when they fled the Church of England, they came to what we now know as the United States. They landed upon the shores of America. And as they landed, they not only believed that they were carrying forth their Anglo-Saxon heritage, but they believed they were doing so under God. And so this is the beginning of this notion of what Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism becomes American exceptionalism, and this notion that we are indeed a city on the hill, meant to show forth what it means to be this great Anglo-Saxon nation under God. You find that in the earliest documents. You find it in the Pilgrim's Mayflower Compact. You find this notion of a city on the hill in John Winthrop's as he talked about in his sermon as the pilgrims came over. For we must consider that we shall be as a city up on a hill, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so calls God to withdraw God's present help from us. Note in all of this, the belief that we are a nation under God with a divine mission, a manifest destiny to indeed promote God's, if you will, God's kingdom, if you will, on earth. This notion of manifest destiny becomes even more inscribed as in 1845, John O'Sullivan would begin to talk about manifest destiny. And what it meant was our people read white people. We're talking about Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. Whiteness becomes the filler for that. Our people have a God-given right, he said, to expand. This was during the period of expansionism from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The right of our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent, which providence has given upon us. And so what we find, and I want to stop sharing my screen at this point, what we find is in the very DNA of this nation is a notion of white supremacy, beginning as Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism, translating into the supremacy of whiteness. If you're white enough, then you are an adopted Anglo-Saxon, because this nation's always had an immigrant problem in that not everybody that looks like a white American is Anglo-Saxon is Anglo-Saxon. So whiteness becomes that thing that identifies American identity. American identity, that is white identity, then also is equated with what it means to be Christian, or to be Christian is to be an American. To be an American is to be Christian, and to be an American is to be white. You see how that comes together over time. And so this becomes the soil out of which white Christian nationalism emerges, which then becomes the soil that produces a figure like a Donald Trump. So how does it so easily take root? How does a Donald Trump so easily emerge? How does white Christian nationalism find such staying power? Because it is in the very foundational DNA of our nation. And it emerges in its most, if you will, vile forms, or in its most vibrant forms, let's say, when indeed the inequality gap in this nation is exacerbated, and when indeed these figures can then begin to play into that gap. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. That, all of you, is really, really an important presentation. And one of the things that I've been looking at recently, and particularly through Innovating for the Public Good, R&D for Democracy, are these underlying dynamics that are forcing this country increasingly to the right. And inequality is one. The second is, this incredible defunding of the public sector to help people who are in very tough situations. And the othering issue is so central to the power building of what we see on the right and, with Trump. So all of that is a part of our history, and it's a purposeful effort by the right to take over more and more institutions. And it's impacting our electoral, system and election results. And so the first question I want you all to sort of address is, as we come in to 2024 and the future, how do we begin to address the anti-democratic thread and push of this particular movement against another history, another American history, which is increasing, openness, increasing democracy, increasing ability for people to have their voices heard in the public square, if you will.
I'd love to take a stab at this, if that's all right. And then if you guys have something to add, it reminds me of something I've heard Ralph Reed say. He's one of the movement's sort of longtime leaders and strategists. He said, pay no attention to the polls. Our numbers are shrinking. All that matters is who turns out on election day. And he's absolutely right about that. You don't need a majority of the country to dominate in election cycles. All you need is a disproportionately mobilized minority. And that's how this cohort, which frankly is a minority of our country, is able to punch above its political weights, why they have such disproportionate political powers, because they vote in large numbers. I believe there was a survey that showed in 2016, the most sort of devoted, I would say, sort of Christian nationalist supporters, the sort of hardest cohort numbered only 10% of the population, but 91% voted in that election and 93% of them voted for Trump. So in a country where we have, I don't know, 40, 50% of people don't bother to vote, and an additional number have their votes essentially stolen from them through race-based gerrymandering, voter suppression, and these kinds of dirty tricks. Again, you don't need a majority. So I think that it's really important to invest in grassroots mobilization and organizing. It's really important to protect the right to vote. It's really important to help people understand that they really do have a stake in our politics. They have a stake in our elections, and their vote really does matter. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to briefly echo that wholeheartedly, which would have been a response. My response as well, Catherine, and highlight something that Catherine said quickly, but I think is worth highlighting. And that is, yes, and of course, Robbie's even pointed out how they are actually a minority. Yet their task is in any way possible to skew the electorate. And so it is not an accident that we are seeing these restrictions coming into play on people's right to vote and giving people access to the ballot. Not only do we have to vote, but we have to be alert to those and understand what they are all about. It is not about loyalty to a nation. It is not about patriotism. It is indeed about loyalty to a quote unquote tribe. And so we have to be clear that under this patriotic guise, that's not what it's about. It is also no accident that these restrictions that are coming into play on who has the right to vote. It's no accident that that's happening in a time when we recognize that the white majority is no longer the majority. And so when you have a minority majority, now if you were a minoritized majority. And so that the majority has been minoritized, and it will further be minoritized and can be minoritized through these kind of voting restrictions. And when we have those voting restrictions, it does give those who are adherents or sympathizers, if you will, to white Christian nationalism, this disproportionate power over our so-called democracy. And so I just want to emphasize the importance of voting, the importance of being engaged in local politics, and the importance of being very aware of the restrictions and the policies that they are bringing forward, all in an effort to restrict and to augment their political power.
Just very quickly, so we get to another question, but just to give you some numbers on this, even 20 years ago, the country was still a majority white Christian country, demographically speaking. So if you took all white Christians together, Protestant, Catholic, non-denominational, they were 54% of the country. And so one of the things that has set off this reaction, and I think made this space for Donald Trump, is the fact that that number, when Donald Trump was first running for office, had slipped from 54 to 47%. And that number today is 42%, right? And so that slippage, right? And with that history that Kelly described and I kind of lay out in my last book, is this slippage, right, of kind of protecting this idea of a white Christian country. And when they've slipped into what's now an undeniable minority position, that's what sets off this kind of conservative, reactionary, kind of any means justify the ends kind of politics, right? So again, the kind of remarkable thing from a group that calls itself values voters, right, slipping into this Machiavellian ends justify the means politics is justified by the sense that they see this as an existential threat. And but just one quick thing about this, The word patriot, I think, is a clue for us here in the way that it's getting used today. It is not being used to defend American democracy. It is not being used to defend the American Constitution. It is being used to protect this undemocratic idea of a white Christian America.
Thanks. Let's open it up now to folks in the audience. I'm sure there are lots and lots of questions or comments.
There are, and thanks everybody for submitting them. And I want to just name that I think we all know that this is a deeply complex issue, and it's not our intention to try to solve it in the next 15 minutes, but rather to continue the conversation and encourage folks in our audience to continue to learn more and continue conversations. I'm going to go ahead and start with the one that is most upvoted, and that came from Frank O'Brien. And I think actually this maybe came during your talk, Robbie. So if you want to kick it off, and then Katherine, Kelly, if you have anything to add. Among these core audiences, does Christian nationalism overwhelm so-called kitchen table economic concerns? Or do the movement leaders somehow align the two? And Robbie, I think you were talking about that a little bit. Would you like to say more about that?
Yeah, we got some concrete data on that. We actually looked at this in depth in a set of studies we did with the Atlantic in 2016 to kind of sort out. There's a lot of debate at that time. Like, was it economic anxiety? Was it cultural anxiety? What was the thing that really drove support for Trump? When I think many pundits were thinking there's no way, right, Trump can come to the head of this party and win a presidential election. And yet, there we were. And what we found there is that these things do work together. So what Kelly's saying about inequality, and I think that initial quote Kelly used, right, that particularly the projection that there is no path forward, right, for your kids, that was really key. One of the most predictive economic measures of support for Trump was the idea that going to college was no longer a path to success, right? And that sense of the kind of American dream and that ladder was broken. That was a kind of core predictor. But even so, when we looked at kind of economic anxiety measures and cultural anxiety measures, if you were making a recipe of support for Trump, what you would want is 3 parts cultural anxiety and 1 part economic anxiety. In other words, the relative power of predictive support for Trump was 3 to 1 cultural to economic. Now it's both. But I think this one thing, particularly political progressives, fail to understand is that, yes, it's both. Economic anxiety is there, but it's about 3 to 1 cultural anxiety to economic anxiety.
Thanks, Robbie. And Kelly or Katherine, is there anything you wanted to add to that quickly, or shall we move on to the next question?
That's great. A really important point. Thank you so much, Robbie. I would add that, it's people are often talking about how the anxiety of the working class. But what's interesting is my understanding is that the economic data shows that it's not the poor necessarily who are supporting Trump. It's often people who feel that things are slipping. But, the polling also shows now a massive gender gap. And I just think, who gets to count as working class? There's, huge racial gaps, also huge gender gap. Is the woman, often a woman of color or in a who's been segregated into like a low-paid job? Does she count as the sort of beleaguered working class when people talk about some of these issues? So I find it very interesting that there is a sector of the movement that is now starting to adopt a kind of economic populist rhetoric. I think about people like Josh Hawley or J.D. Vance, who are, of course, there's some funding there from Peter Thiel, who is a tech billionaire. And I just wonder, when they're sort of touting the working class, who exactly are they really talking about?
Thank you, Katherine. Okay.
Yes, can I just quickly say yes to that, and that we have to always bear in mind, even when we recognize that people of color and women are especially on the bottom, and the inequality gap, the wealth gap is the greatest there. This narrative isn't inclusive of them. So we have to recognize that this is a racialized narrative. So the white in Christian nationalism becomes very significant. And that allows a figure like Trump to espouse his, of course, bigoted sort of white supremacist kind of views, but also it allows him to play upon, if not plant fears in this very demographic that will support him. So I just want to emphasize that, yes, the wealth gap suggests that it is a racialized gap, but this narrative is a racialized white narrative. So the white part of that becomes really significant.
Definitely. Thank you, Dr. Douglas. Okay, so there's a series of questions that are all coming up with a similar theme. I want to give some credit to our audience here. We've got a question from David Slifka, from John Isaacs, from Emily Robinson, from Karen Mulhauser. These are all, they have very specific questions to them. And just in the interest of time, I'm going to group them together. And this is something that our audiences are often asking, and it's a really hard question to answer. And that is, what do we do? What is effective in countering these messages? Whether we happen to have folks in our families that we're talking with, whether we're out on the campaign trail talking to people, trying to convince them to vote. Is it issues that get to people? Are there specific tactics that get to people? Are there groups that are doing this really well? I'd love to hear from each of you on this, because I'm sure you each have wisdom to share. And Dr. Douglas, can we start with you?
Oh, I was hoping you wouldn't start with me. Because you're right. It's funny. I just taught a class this weekend, a seminar on white Christian nationalism. What is it and what do we do about it? And this question of what do we do about it, and engaged with folks like Catherine Christian Dumais, Walter Brueggemann, Jamar Tisby, who are also reflecting upon this issue, and what do we do about it? And, you know, one of the things to recognize, and I'd be interested in hearing both Robbie and Catherine's response to this, is especially when you're talking about adherents, they aren't a movable group. Perhaps sympathizers are. Christian Dumais reminds us that the people we ought to be worried about are, I forget a particular term for it, but sort of the people who stand around, sort of the onlookers. Those are the people. That is the demographic that we need to concern ourselves with engaging, and helping them to understand the threat, and to go to the polls, and to vote, and to begin to, you know, people, I think our power is local in so many respects, and to help people to understand how these local issues really are the issues that feed this narrative and give power to it. And so I encourage people to get involved in the local politics of your community, get involved in what's going on, and know what's going on the school board. So to get involved there, from my vantage point as an Episcopal priest, as a clergy person, you know, faith communities have to get involved. And they have to be the ones that began to engage these topics. And I think, Robbie, you can speak to this. One of the polls that PRI did revealed that people in the faith community do want to have guidance on these social issues. Even if they don't want their churches to be involved in politics, they want guidance on these social, particularly controversial social justice issues. And so our churches have to get involved in that, and begin to create atmospheres and spaces for just these kind of discussions. We aren't trying to convince people, but let's inform them. And so I think that that's what's most important. And, you know, with our families and the kitchen table talk, let's try to inform them, and then just encourage people to be involved.
Thank you very much. And let me just say a little bit more about David's comment here, because Catherine, there's a specific shout out to you. It's David Slifka says, Catherine, thank you for your great book. I was struck by the many concrete examples of how this movement drives opinion and votes, including voter guides, culture impact teams, pastor conferences, and tools, for example, sermon starters and data tools for churches. And I've already said this part of his question, but I'll gladly repeat it. What organizations or individuals are working to create comparable things with pro-pluralism or pro-democracy elements? Or what other strategies are useful and who is working on them? Thank you so much, David, for that question.
Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate that. And there are a lot of organizations that are getting involved in democracy building. There are no shortage of avenues for engagement. You sort of have to find one that resonates with you and get involved. Reverend Douglas, I really appreciate your summary of what we can do. There's so many ways to get involved on the local level, and also a lot of national organizations need our support. A lot of sort of voter registration and voter engagement initiatives need our support. Yeah, I mean, if you I don't want to sort of name names right here. Frankly, we don't have enough time to go through all of them, but there are so many. I want to point out that there are faith-based organizations as well. Just a few of them, Vote Common Good, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, Faithful America, Baptist Joint Committee. There are so many others that are New Evangelicals, so many other organizations that are doing their best to raise awareness of this issue, assure people that this is not a representative of Christianity as they understand it, and also to engage them in the political process in meaningful ways. So thank you so much.
One of the things I want to note before we go is that there is a fear-based element to their motivation to vote in terms of being displaced and losing their place in American culture, American society, and losing opportunities for themselves and their children. So fear is a great motivator. And one of the issues I think that we need to address is, what is our motivator? What is our motivating emotion? Because this drives turnout. And if we don't understand how to capture and relate how we talk about issues, and understand how issues relate to emotions and then lead to motivation to turn out, I think that will be an opportunity missed.
Well, I'll just jump in real quick on that. I do think it's sort of, well, when I've talked about this, I've just said it as straightforward as I can. Like, we are in many ways facing a question again that we have just kicked down the road for most of our democracy, right? And if I were to say it as kind of pointedly as I can, the question is, are we a kind of promised land for European Christians? Is that who America is, right? Or are we a pluralistic democracy where everyone stands on equal footing before the law? And it's a fundamental question, and it's a real question, I think, that's in front of us and being put maybe as pointedly as it has in my lifetime, right in front of us. And so I think in terms of motivation, I mean, protecting democracy, making a real claim for pluralism, and that vision of the country, I think, is really important. And if I have a concern, I think, in the coming contest, is that we're going to have an asymmetry between a kind of broad cultural vision driven by the Trump machine and a kind of narrow economic vision driven by the Biden campaign. And I don't think those things are going to be matched very well. I think the power is in this kind of broader cultural vision. And I think, both sides need to sort of meet on that ground. In many ways, that's the existential threat in front of us.
Well, I want to end by saying thank you. This was a fascinating discussion. Lots and lots of other topics relating to this could have been covered. And I'm sure some of the audiences would like to be in touch with you directly and have remaining questions. So if you do, please contact us and let us know. We'll try to answer them and also get you connected to the right person. So thank you very much for attending. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks on another topic, which is, what is political advertising worth in terms of dollars and efficaciousness? All right. See you then. Bye-bye.